The snow in the Ardennes that winter was unlike anything the soldiers had seen before. Thick, heavy flakes drifted down endlessly, smothering the forest in silence. It was December 1944, the heart of the Battle of the Bulge. The American lines had been stretched thin, and German forces had launched a surprise counteroffensive that threatened to split the Allied front in two. The air was cold enough to bite through uniforms, and the men of the 101st Infantry Regiment could see their breath turn to mist as they waited in their foxholes. Among them was Sergeant James "Jimmy" Reynolds, a man who, by all accounts, should have died that winter. But what he did instead became legend. Reynolds had been a farmer before the war, a quiet, broad-shouldered man from Ohio who never wanted to be a hero. He was known for his patience, his easy smile, and the way he always shared his rations. When he was drafted in 1942, he told his wife, "I'll do my job and come home." He had no illusions of glory. But war has a way of finding men who don't seek it. By late December, his squad was stationed near a frozen crossroad outside the town of Hufalais. Their orders were simple: hold the road no matter what. That road connected two critical supply routes, and losing it would open the way for German armor to advance deeper into Allied territory. There were 12 of them in total, 12 men to stop an army. The first few days were quiet, too quiet. The men grew uneasy. The forest around them seemed alive with whispers. Somewhere out there, in the mist and trees, the enemy was moving. They could hear engines at night, muffled voices, sometimes even footsteps in the snow. Then came the shelling. The first barrage hit just before dawn. The earth convulsed, trees exploded into splinters, and the sky turned orange with fire. The men dove for cover as shells rained down on their position. Reynolds shouted over the thunder, "Hold your line! Keep your heads down!" The bombardment lasted for nearly 10 minutes, shaking the ground like an earthquake. When it stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. That's when the attack began. German infantry poured from the tree line, their gray uniforms blending with the snow. Machine guns opened up from every direction. Bullets ripped through the branches. The Americans returned fire, but they were outnumbered 10-1. Reynolds moved between foxholes, checking on his men, barking orders, passing ammunition. "Keep firing! They bleed the same as we do!" he yelled, his voice steady despite the chaos. Private Mills, the youngest in the squad, later said he'd never seen anything like it. "He was everywhere at once," Mills recalled after the war. "Bullets flying, trees falling, and there's the Sarge, just standing up like it was a damn parade, telling us where to shoot. I thought he was crazy. Then I realized he was the only thing keeping us together." The first wave broke against them like surf on rock. Dozens of Germans fell, but more came. A tank rolled out of the fog, a Panzer IV, its turret sweeping toward their position. "Anti-tank!" Reynolds yelled. 2 men rushed forward with a bazooka, firing from behind a log. The rocket struck the Panzer's tracks, blowing them apart. The tank slewed sideways, smoking. The squad cheered, but it was short-lived. A second shell from somewhere else exploded near their line, and the world went white. When Reynolds came to, he couldn't feel his legs. The blast had thrown him several feet and shredded his left side. His uniform was torn open, blood pooling in the snow beneath him. Around him the forest burned. He could hear the faint cries of his men calling for help. His vision blurred, but one thought cut through the haze: they're still out there. He dragged himself forward. Each movement sent fire through his body. His right arm was still working, and that was enough. He reached the nearest foxhole, where Private Mills was clutching his rifle, eyes wide with terror. "You're hit, Sarge," the boy cried. Reynolds grinned weakly. "Just a scratch," he said. "Pass me that ammo." He set up his Browning machine gun on the edge of the hole. His hands trembled, but his aim was steady. When the next wave came, he opened fire. The barrel roared, the weapon bucking in his hands. The Germans fell in heaps, their advance slowing. For hours, he fired, reloaded, and fired again. When the gun overheated, he switched to a rifle. When he ran out of clips, he grabbed grenades. His body was breaking, But his will refused to. Night fell over the Ardennes. The temperature dropped below freezing. The snow was stained red. And still, Sergeant Reynolds fought. The night in the Ardennes was merciless. By midnight, the snow had turned into shards of ice carried by a bitter wind that howled through the forest like a wounded animal. The temperature plunged below zero, and the only light came from the occasional flare drifting across the sky, each burst illuminating the battlefield in ghostly white for a few seconds before darkness swallowed it again. Reynolds was still there. His leg was gone from the knee down, and what remained of it was wrapped in a torn bandage of his own uniform. Every breath came out as a cloud of steam. His machine gun sat in front of him, steaming from the heat of constant fire. Around him lay empty shell casings, frozen blood, and the bodies of the men who had fought beside him. He could hear voices, German voices, moving through the trees. They were searching for survivors, finishing off the wounded. Reynolds pressed his back against the icy earth, his heart pounding in the silence. He knew if he made a sound, it was over. The crunch of boots drew closer. A flashlight beam swept past his foxhole. For a moment, the light caught his face, pale, blood-smeared, motionless. The beam lingered, then moved on. The soldiers kept walking, laughing quietly. Reynolds exhaled only when the sound of footsteps faded. He tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was suffocating. The pain in his side pulsed with every heartbeat. He thought of home, of the cornfields in Ohio, of his wife, of his little girl who had just learned to write her name. He had promised her he'd come back. "Don't worry, Daddy's strong," he'd said. Now, lying there in the snow, he wondered if she'd ever know what happened to him. He must have drifted off, because when his eyes opened again, dawn was breaking. A thin layer of frost covered everything. He tried to move and gasped. His wound had frozen to the ground. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the rumble of engines again. The Germans were regrouping for another push. Reynolds knew the squad couldn't hold much longer. The last he'd seen of his men, they were scattered, some wounded, some dead. If the enemy reached that crossroads, everything they'd fought for would be lost. He looked at his machine gun, jammed, frozen solid. He tore off his gloves and worked at the bolt with his bare hands until the metal tore into his skin. Finally, with a click, the weapon came back to life. He set it up on the ridge overlooking the road. He could barely sit upright, so he tied himself to a tree with a length of telephone wire. He loaded one last belt of ammunition and whispered, "Let's finish this." The first German scouts appeared just after sunrise. They were cautious now, creeping forward with rifles ready, expecting no resistance. Then Reynolds opened fire. The first burst cut down the lead group instantly. The rest dove for cover, shouting in confusion. To them, it must have seemed impossible. How could anyone still be alive up there after last night? They regrouped, tried to flank him, but every time a helmet moved, Reynolds' gun spat fire. He was running on pure instinct now. Every nerve screamed at him to stop, but something deeper, something primal, refused. When the gun finally clicked empty, he reached for his rifle. When the rifle jammed, he threw grenades. When the grenades were gone, he crawled to the next fallen soldier and took his weapon. He didn't feel like a man anymore. He was something else, a force that refused to die. The hours dragged on. Smoke and snow mixed in the air, turning the world into a blur of gray. He could hear German officers shouting orders, calling for artillery. Then came the explosion. The shell hit just 10 feet away. The blast threw him backward, slamming him into the frozen ground. He couldn't hear. His vision went white, then black. His helmet was gone. Blood ran from his ears. When he woke again, he didn't know how much time had passed. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The forest was quiet. His body felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He tried to move and realized he couldn't feel anything below his waist. The smell of smoke filled the air. Somewhere far away, he thought he heard an engine, not German, but American. He wasn't sure if it was real. Maybe he was dying. Maybe it was all a dream. But then, faintly, he heard shouting, English voices this time. Reinforcements.
He tried to call out, but his throat made no sound. His vision flickered again. He crawled forward, one arm pulling him inch by inch through the snow. Every drag left a dark red trail behind him. He reached for the gun, the same Browning that had saved them, and fired one last burst into the trees, not at the enemy, but as a signal. A flare went up. The sound of American engines grew louder. And then he finally let go. The first thing he saw when consciousness returned was a circle of faces hanging over him like a pale winter moon. Parkas, frost on eyebrows, eyes blown wide from what they were seeing. "He's alive," someone breathed, equal parts disbelief and relief. Hands slid under his shoulders.
He felt the distant pressure of a stretcher, the soft give of snow under it, the jolt of boots breaking crust as they carried him down slope. Somewhere behind them, a half-melted gun barrel smoked like an exhausted lung. A medic with a Red Cross armband leaned in close. "Sergeant, stay with me. Name?" Reynolds tried to form a word, but his throat rasped dry air. The medic uncapped a canteen, tipped a trickle past cracked lips. "Jimmy," he managed. It came out as steam. "Good. Jimmy, I'm Thompson. I'm gonna put a tourniquet high. This'll hurt." Thompson pulled a strap tight above what remained of the leg. Pain arced through him like lightning. It brought the world into focus. The metallic taste, the diesel drift of idling engines, the clatter of a 50 cal somewhere like distant thunder. They moved him behind a knocked-out half-track and set up a small island of order in the chaos. Scissors, morphine syrettes, bandage tins pried open with numb fingers. Thompson worked with a pianist's economy, packing gauze, checking pulse, rolling him on his side to probe the ragged wound along his ribs. "How long were you up there?" someone asked. Reynolds blinked at the sky. "One night," he whispered, then corrected himself. "A lifetime." Thompson shot him a look. "You earned it twice over." The sounds of battle thinned, then receded, as they loaded him onto a jeep for the trip to a field dressing station. The vehicle's canvas flapped and snapped in the wind, giving him fitful glimpses of frozen trees sliding by like sentinels. A private perched at his feet cradled his ankle as if it were made of glass. "You did good, Sarge," the kid said, voice trembling with adrenaline. "Saved our skins, all of us." Reynolds stared at the boy's freckles, at the smear of gun oil on his cheek. He wanted to say something wise, something that would stick. What came out was simple. Make it count. The aid station smelled of ether, iodine, and damp wool. Voices overlapped. Triage calls, a chaplain murmuring, a corporal swearing softly as he tried to warm his hands over a stove the size of a helmet. Thompson handed Reynolds off with a quick summary, his voice suddenly professional, hard-edged. BP low, massive blood loss, hypothermic, possible tympanic rupture. The surgeon nodded once and bent over him with a focused calm that steadied the room. "Sergeant Reynolds," the doctor said, "we're going to take care of you. You'll sleep. When you wake, you'll curse me. That's how I'll know I did my job." The needle slid home. The world softened at the edges, then unfurled backward. He was 19 again, a harvest dusk over Ohio, the fields stubbled gold after the combine. His father's hands were thick and scarred, the nails rimmed with honest dirt. "Strength isn't loud," his father said, leaning on the fence. "It's consistent." The smell of cut hay swallowed him. Fireflies winked on like distant towns. He remembered the weight of the draft letter in his pocket, the way his stomach had dropped when he read the return address, how his mother's eyes had watered and then gone suddenly fierce. "You'll go," she'd said, "and you'll come back. Promise me." He had promised, with the certainty of boys. Fort Benning came next, sun glaring off helmets, cadence chants bouncing between barracks. He learned quickly because he listened. How to break down a Browning blindfolded, how to read a map by the slope of land under his boots, how to keep men moving when the only thing they wanted was to stop. He wasn't the fastest or the loudest, but he set a metronome in motion and never let it falter.
When instructors looked down a row of recruits and asked a question, his hand rose almost without his consent. Not to show off, because the silence offended him. There was Sicily, a sunburnt island that baked salt into uniforms until they cracked. Salerno, where the surf was pink and the sand sucked at your boots as if the sea wanted to keep you. Anzio, where they dug into the earth like moles and learned that artillery had a personality, petulant one hour, murderous the next. He collected lessons like cartridge clips. Men follow the one who knows where to put his eyes. Don't waste anger, it burns fuel you'll need later. Share your rations, even when you hate the guy. Hate is heavy to carry. Laugh where you can, quietly, because humor is a shovel for the soul. He woke to a ceiling of tent canvas, his breath fogging in the cold trapped underneath. A nurse was there, cheeks raw from the wind, hair tucked under a kerchief. She checked his pupils with a small penlight, then smiled when he flinched. Back with us. He tried to sit. Ropes of pain pinned him down. The blankets felt like slabs of earth. Easy, she said, her voice a hand on his chest. You're a stubborn one. He didn't argue. She adjusted the drip with brisk fingers. What's your daughter's name? He blinked. Annie. Saying it opened something in his chest that medicine couldn't reach. We'll make sure you can write her, the nurse said. Soon. The battalion commander came later, a colonel who looked carved from last year's oak. He stood at the cot's foot, cap under his arm, eyes taking inventory of bandages as if they were unit strength. Sergeant Reynolds, he said, heavy with formal gravity. Your actions at the crossroads prevented a breakthrough. Reports indicate you held an entire company at bay. The words sounded foreign, like titles in a language Reynolds didn't speak. He tried to deflect. Boys did the work. The colonel's mouth tightened, not quite a smile. They did because you did. I'll be recommending you for high honors. He paused, then added lower, less ceremonial. You kept my men alive. Thank you. When he left, the tent felt larger and colder. Sleep came in chopped pieces. In the small hours, a chaplain sat on the next cot, boots braced on the floorboards, whispering a psalm to a man who wouldn't live till dawn. The words threaded the dark with a quiet dignity. Valley of the shadow, rod and staff, a table prepared. Reynolds let the syllables wash through him like warm rain. He wasn't a church-going man, not really, but the cadence felt like marching in step. He catalogued the feeling and tucked it away for the pain. When he could hold a pencil again, 2 fingers and stubbornness, he wrote to Annie on a blue V-mail form. The letters were clumsy, hills and fences on a winter road. He told her the important thing. Daddy kept his promise. He told her to help her mother with the hens, to read the book with the brave little engine twice, to watch for the first robin because it meant spring was real, even when it didn't feel like it. He did not write about snow turned red, or melted barrels, or the way the forest listens when men stop moving. He did not need those things to cross an ocean. Outside, the war continued its mechanical appetite. Trucks came and went, tires chewing slush. Stretcher-bearers moved like metronomes. Someone strummed 3 chords on a dented guitar until an officer told him to knock it off. Rumors filtered through canvas like wood smoke. Patton's boys driving hard. The Bulge shrinking. Bastogne holding, because some towns learned the word before they need it. Each rumor warmed the tent a degree. The nurse, her name was Keller, he learned because she wrote it on his splint with a stub of pencil like a graffitied pledge. Brought him news of his squad. 4 wounded, 2 serious, 3 with frostbite bad enough to send them back, 2 unscathed except for the look in their eyes that unscathed men wear like a second dog tag. They had started calling him the Immortal before the morphine wore off. Keller said it with a teasing tilt. You've got a fan club. He shrugged, which hurt, and said, It's a bad nickname. Sounds like tempting God. She tapped the edge of the cot. Or gratitude. Depends who's saying it. Men he barely knew visited in skittering pairs, boys with chapped knuckles and too large uniforms. They stood stiff and uncomfortable and told him variants of the same thing. "We saw you up there. We didn't believe it until we did." One asked how long you can fire a Browning before the barrel melts. Reynolds said, "Long enough," and they laughed at the deadpan, relieved to have permission. He watched their shoulders lower an inch on the way out. Sometimes leadership is a hand wave from a cot. At twilight one day, a supply sergeant slid a wrapped rectangle onto his blanket. "Your effects," he said, as if delivering a bill. Inside lay his dog tags, blackened around the edges. A pocket New Testament his mother had pressed into his hand at the depot. A photograph. A young woman with wind in her hair, a little girl squinting into sun. Both squashed into the frame by the clumsy love of a man who doesn't know where to put his hands in a picture. The corner of the photo was cracked. He smoothed it with a thumb until the crack became a river that belonged there. He asked for a map. Keller frowned, then smuggled one in under a tray of soup. He traced the road that had mattered with a fingernail, following the contour lines that told the truth about ground. On the map, the crossroads was a mute intersection of ink. On the earth, it had been a promise. He understood both realities could be true at once. That night, he slept without dreams for the first time since the blast. Recovery was a campaign fought trench by trench. The first victory was sitting up without vomiting. The second was standing between parallel bars while a corporal swore inventive encouragement. The third was falling and not swearing at all.
He learned the choreography of prosthetics, the timber walk sway of early days, the small compensations of hip and lower back, the way stairs require their own theology. Payne taught, then took. He paid attention. He always had. Letters found him now, stacks of them, because rumor travels faster than trucks. A boy from another regiment wrote that his brother had been at the crossroads and wouldn't shut up about a sergeant tied to a tree, which made their mother cry and their father pour a second cup of coffee without comment. A school back in Ohio sent a card with 22 signatures, most of them spelling his name wrong with beautiful confidence. He put that one on the crate beside his bed where he could see it in the mornings when courage was scarce. One afternoon, the colonel returned with a man in a long coat who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and bureaucracy. Citations were read, passages with phrases like conspicuous gallantry and above and beyond. The words landed on the blankets like snowflakes, melting into the weave, leaving the fabric heavier and somehow cleaner. Reynolds thought of Mills, of the boy with the freckled cheek, of the private who had carried his ankle like glass, of Keller's penciled name on his splint. He wished there were a medal for collective stubbornness. He wished there was a ribbon called stayed, and it would be the color of wet wool. That night, when the ward quieted and the stove ticked as it cooled, Keller sat at the foot of his bed and asked a question no one else had. "Why did you tie yourself to the tree?" He considered lying. He considered the easy answer, because the firing position was good, because it gave him a field of view, because sometimes geography decides your options. He opted for the harder one. "Because I knew I'd pass out," he said, "and I wanted to wake up still facing the road." Keller nodded once, eyes bright in the lamplight. "That's an answer a farmer would give." He smiled, and for a moment the tent glowed as if summer had slipped under the flap. When he finally walked, limped, into the pale midday sun outside the rehab tent, the air smelled different. Not of ether or wool or stove smoke, but of thaw and oil and churned earth, as if the forest itself had loosened its jaw. He clumped forward, one step, then the next, learning the new mathematics of his body. A truck backfired. He didn't flinch. The horizon looked closer, as if the land had leaned in to hear him breathing. Behind him, the nickname traveled like contraband, collecting details, polishing itself on eager tongues. In front of him lay a road that didn't appear on any map he owned, a route where the mile markers were made of choices. He squared his shoulders carefully, conserving fuel, and took another step. The hospital released him in the spring of 1946, after the snow had melted and the roads ran like veins across the countryside again. The war was over. Europe was rubble and smoke, but the world seemed almost too bright now.
When the ship carried him back across the Atlantic, the deck smelled of salt and paint and new beginnings that didn't quite feel real. He leaned on the rail, staring at the horizon, and thought of the crossroads. How quiet it must be now, just trees and the wind, as if none of it had ever happened.
New York Harbor came into view under a low, gray sky. The Statue of Liberty stood there like she was waiting for them, her torch a faint blur in the mist. Other soldiers cheered, some cried. Reynolds simply took off his cap. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes belong to the dead. Reporters met them at the dock, snapping pictures of bandaged limbs, of medals glinting in weak sunlight. A nurse wheeled him down the gangplank. Flashes popped. One journalist shouted, "Sergeant Reynolds, the immortal sergeant, how does it feel to be back?" He wanted to say something profound, but all that came out was cold. The crowd laughed, and the photo ran the next day with that single word as the headline. He went home to Ohio in a train car full of strangers trying to sound normal again. A farmer's hands felt clumsy around the aluminum of a prosthetic leg. The fields were still there, neat rows pushing green shoots into the air, but they looked smaller somehow. His wife met him at the station wearing the same red scarf she'd worn the day he left. His daughter hid behind her skirts at first, then ran forward and wrapped herself around his waist. "Daddy, you walk funny," she said. He laughed, and something in his chest cracked open. The first weeks were easy enough. Neighbors brought casseroles and pies. The church put his picture in the foyer. People stopped him on Main Street to shake his hand. "We're proud of you, Jim," they said. "You're one of the good ones." But every night, when the house fell quiet and the furnace sighed, the forest came back. The smell of cordite, the sound of snow turning to mud under boots, the faces of the men he couldn't save. He tried farming again. The rhythm was familiar: soil, seed, water, harvest. But his body moved differently now. The prosthetic bit into his thigh when he worked too long, and the phantom pain woke him before dawn. Sometimes he found himself staring at the line of trees at the far end of the field, expecting to see movement, to hear the low thud of artillery from a horizon that no longer existed. Letters arrived from his old squad. Mills wrote from Detroit, where he'd found work in a factory. "Can't stand loud noises," the letter said, "but the pay's good." Another came from Keller, now back in Chicago nursing at a veterans hospital. "They keep calling men immortal here," she wrote, "but it usually just means they survived what should have killed them. I hope you're doing better than most." He read her words 3 times and tucked the letter into his wallet. One afternoon, the local paper asked him to speak at the Memorial Day ceremony. He didn't want to, but the mayor insisted. So he stood on the courthouse steps in his pressed uniform, the medal catching the sun, and looked out over the crowd. Families, school children, widows with folded flags in their laps. When his turn came, he cleared his throat. "They call me the immortal sergeant," he began, "but that's not true. I just didn't die when I was supposed to. The ones who didn't come back, they're the real immortals. They live every time we remember them." The square fell silent except for a flag snapping in the wind. When he finished, no one clapped right away. Then they did, slowly, the kind of applause that isn't for performance, but for understanding. After that, the town left him mostly alone, which was exactly what he needed. He built a small workshop behind the barn, where he repaired neighbors' tools, mended watches, fixed radios. The steady tick of gears was medicine. Sometimes, when kids from the school came by to ask about the war, he'd show them the melted barrel from his Browning, mounted on the wall like a relic. "This," he'd say, "is what happens when you don't know when to quit." They'd laugh, not fully getting it, and that was fine. Childhood should stay innocent a little longer. Years passed that way. The country moved on, new wars, new names, new parades. His hair turned silver. Annie grew tall, married, had children of her own. She once brought her son to the farm and whispered, "Tell him the story, Dad." Reynolds just shook his head. No need, he's got his own to write someday. But history has a habit of finding its way back. In 1969, a young historian from the Army War College tracked him down. He was compiling oral accounts of the Battle of the Bulge. "Sir," the historian said, recorder clicking softly on the table, "men still talk about you. They say you tied yourself to a tree to keep fighting." Reynolds smiled faintly. "That part's true." "Why'd you do it?" the man asked, eager for myth. Reynolds thought a long moment. "Because someone had to." The historian frowned, waiting for more, but there wasn't any more. Sometimes a simple answer is the only honest one. In the evenings, Reynolds would sit on the porch, the prosthetic resting stiffly, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. The fields glowed gold under the setting sun. The world was quieter now, but every once in a while he'd hear thunder rolling across the hills and feel a quick, impossible jolt, the echo of distant guns. He'd close his eyes, breathe, and let it pass. When Keller visited him decades later, gray hair now, same steady eyes, she found him mending a fence. "You still working?" she teased. "Keeps me human," he said. She looked around at the peaceful land. "You ever miss it?" He knew what she meant. "No," he said softly, "but I remember it." The letter from the Pentagon arrived in an envelope too official to ignore. Thick paper, an eagle stamped into the flap. Reynolds opened it with a pocket knife at the kitchen table while the kettle muttered on the stove. Inside, an invitation to Washington for a ceremony marking the 25th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. "Your presence," it read in the careful language of government, "would honor the service of all enlisted men who bore the heaviest loads." He stared at the words for a long time, then folded the letter and slid it beneath the magnet on the icebox door. He didn't want to go. Crowds weren't his world. But Annie phoned that evening and said, "Dad, you went to hell for them. You can go to Washington for an afternoon." So he shaved, put on the best suit he owned, and let a bus carry him past miles of fields that thinned into suburbs and then into the marble of the capital. The city felt like a museum where the displays had opinions. Flags lined the avenue, and the air smelled like rain on hot stone. They seated him in the front row of an auditorium, too large for human voices. The walls carried everything to the back and returned it dressed in echo. A general who had never been cold in the Ardennes spoke about sacrifice. When he finished, aides shepherded Reynolds backstage to a small room with coffee in urns and a tray of sandwiches that looked designed by committee. Men shook his hand with practiced warmth. Cameras blinked like patient insects. A young private, tasked with escort duty, stood rigid at his side, cheeks newly shaved, eyes bright. "Sir," the kid said in a whisper that tripped over itself, "my granddad was at Bastogne. He used to tell me about a sergeant who—" He stopped, embarrassed by the cliché he was about to utter. Reynolds rescued him. "Your granddad's the one who mattered," he said. The private's grin came easy after that. When they pinned another ribbon to the bar already hanging heavy on his lapel, he felt the weight and thought of wet wool. The ceremony ended. The audience applauded like rain on a roof. In the quiet that followed, a woman from a news magazine asked for an interview. She had a legal pad and a pen that wrote in black, as serious as a courtroom. "They call you the immortal sergeant," she began. "What do you make of that?" He shrugged. "Names stick to stories. Stories stick to people. I'm just one man." She leaned forward. "Do you ever— guilty?" He let the question sit. "Survivor's guilt?" she clarified. "The term came later," he said. "The feeling didn't. It visits, I pour it a cup of coffee. It leaves when it's ready." The article, when it ran, surprised him with its gentleness. No heroic adjectives stacked like sandbags, just clean sentences about a clean truth, that endurance can be quiet and heroism isn't always loud. For a time, letters doubled, then tripled. A man from Vermont wrote that he'd kept the issue folded in his wallet through a layoff and a divorce because the line about coffee and guilt made him laugh the only honest laugh he'd had that winter.
A school teacher in Texas asked for a copy of any photo from the war for her classroom wall. He sent her the melted barrel instead, a Polaroid of it anyway, and wrote on the back, "This is what stubbornness looks like when it gets hot." As the years settled, the Army formalized remembrance. A staff-wide curriculum for young officers added a module, Crossroads Defense Sergeant Reynolds. They walked the ground in winter, breath streaming, maps flapping, a captain pointing out fields of fire. A laminated packet included excerpts from after-action reports, a grainy photo of the ridgeline, and a short paragraph labeled Leadership Notes. Tied himself to a tree, not symbolism, logistics. Faced the road, chose to fight the battle he could see. In a classroom thousands of miles away, his choice became bullet points and chalk dust. But some of the captains carried the lesson deeper than their notebooks. He could tell from the letters that found him. "Sir, I'm not sure you'll ever read this, but I want you to know your story helped me last month when my platoon was 3 days into the flood response and the radios kept dying." Time did what it does. His gait slowed. The prosthetic squeaked on humid days.
He learned the small domestic arts of age, how to sit down without making it look like surrender, how to accept help without giving away dignity, how to say, "I'm fine," in a tone that meant not quite, but close enough. He took to carrying a cane carved from hickory. It was practical, but also an honest prop. When children asked, he said it was a walking stick, not a war stick. That amused their parents and pleased him more than it should have. Annie's boy, now a man with his own boy, brought a video camera one Thanksgiving and set it on the end of the table. After the pie, while the house hummed with dishwater and football noise, the grandson asked, almost shy, "Grandpa, would you tell the story for us, so we have it?" Reynolds stared at the small red light blinking like a heartbeat. He didn't trust cameras. But family alters the math. He spoke for 20 minutes, plain and spare, naming men when he could, naming weather when he couldn't. He ended the only way he knew how. "I did my job, the others did theirs. That's the story." Years later, after he was gone, that tape would live in a shoebox, and then on a hard drive, and then, inevitably, in a classroom, where teenagers watched with the baffled respect we reserve for realities we can't fully imagine. Awards came in odd clusters, quiet years, then 3 invitations in a row. The state legislature issued a proclamation on a day when the air smelled like cut grass and lemonade. A veterans group presented him with a plaque etched with an eagle so muscular it seemed to be complaining. He accepted, smiled, posed, went home, and used the plaque as a bookend. The books it held were practical: manuals on small engine repair, a field guide to North American birds, a collection of Lincoln's speeches with dog-eared pages. He read the second inaugural like scripture, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He tried to live that way, even on mornings when the cane thumped harder than usual. When Keller passed, a letter came from her niece with a program tucked inside. White paper, black ink, a small cross. "She spoke of you," the niece wrote, "said you answered a question right once." He carried that line around for a week like a smooth stong in a pocket. At her graveside, in a city he'd only visited twice, he stood with his hat in his hands and thought of the penciled name on a brace, and the way she said gratitude like a fact, not a garnish. The last public interview he gave was to a local radio station that broadcast baseball games and farm reports between church services and polka on Saturdays. The host asked what he would say to young soldiers headed into a world that would almost certainly ask too much of them. Reynolds considered. "Decide your job before you meet the storm," he said. "It's hard to choose a compass in a hurricane. And take care of your people. Tools break, plans fail. People don't if you keep them together." The line wasn't clever enough to become famous. It was useful enough to be repeated. He gardened more. Tomatoes overtook their cages and spilled into a red generosity that stained his fingers. He staked beans and watched them climb in a script someone else had written. Some evenings, He would walk the rows with the cane and talk to the plants like recruits, gentle, corrective, approving when approval was earned. The land listened without judgment. On the porch, at dusk, he'd set the cane aside and let the crickets fill the spaces that words used to occupy. The stroke came on a cool September morning when the sky was the color of a pressed shirt and the light had that crisp honesty the year saves for itself after harvest. Annie found him in the workshop, seated at the bench, a screwdriver resting in his palm, as if it had fallen asleep there. The ambulance was quick, the hospital efficient, the doctors humane. He woke, faded, woke again. Annie sat beside him and read aloud from the field guide. Nuthatch, towhee, cardinal, while machines recorded their own unpoetic facts. When the chaplain asked if he wanted a prayer, Reynolds said yes, and the man chose the one about the valley and the shadow and the fear that loses its name when you walk through it holding someone else's sleeve. On his last evening, he asked for the window to be opened a few inches. Outside, night insects stitched a steady seam. He turned his head toward the sound and smiled. "Metronome," he whispered. Annie leaned close. "What, Dad?" "Keeps you together," he said, eyes on a place she could not see. He slept. He did not wake. The funeral was small by design. Family, a few neighbors, 2 men who had once been boys in his squad and now walked with their own careful arithmetic. The flag folded into triangles. The rifles cracked the air into solemn pieces. The bugle's last note hung like a bird that had changed its mind mid-flight. Annie spoke briefly. She told the story about the newspaper headline, "Cold," and the one about the tree and the wire and the road he wanted to face. She didn't call him immortal. She didn't need to. After the burial, the Army sent a representative with a certificate and a handshake. The town council debated naming the new bridge after him. They settled on the crossroads at the county line. A sign went up, Reynolds Crossing. Drivers passed it at 55 without seeing it most days, but sometimes a veteran would slow and nod, and sometimes a teenager would ask a parent, and sometimes a parent would know. That was enough. In a basement classroom at a military academy, a captain clicked to the next slide. A black and white photo of a bare winter ridge. A paragraph about one man with a machine gun. A bullet that said, "Tie yourself to the mission." He told his cadets that history is built out of logistics and weather and decisions made by people who intend to keep their promises. He told them that immortality is just the echo a life leaves in other lives. Then he turned off the projector and took them outside into the cold to walk because you can't learn topography from a screen. Back in Ohio, a melted gun barrel still hung on a workshop wall, heavy as a sentence that refuses to end. Dust settled on it, the way years do. When the late sun slanted through the window just right, the metal caught the light and glowed, as if remembering heat. If you stood there and listened, really listened, you could almost hear the slow tick of a metronome and the sound of someone facing the road. Winter returned to the crossroads long after the war had emptied from it. The trees grew thick again, and the road crew laid a smoother bed of asphalt that glimmered after rain. If you didn't know the story, it was just a bend where 2 county lanes met and then parted like acquaintances. But cadets still came some winters, stamping their boots, holding photocopied packets gone soft at the corners. A captain would stop them mid-slope and say, "Feel this wind. Now imagine it harder. Imagine you haven't slept. Imagine you're the senior man left. What do you choose?" The answers changed with each class, the way rivers change with rain, but the question stayed fixed like bedrock. In a museum 3 states away, a small case held a coil of frayed field telephone wire, a brass buckle bent at a sharp angle, and a typed card. Visitors drifted by. Many never paused. But sometimes a grandfather would stop, lift a child under the arm so the glass didn't smear, and say, "Once a man tied himself to a tree so he wouldn't fall away from his duty." The child would look from wire to face, from face to card, and catalog the odd, stubborn courage that doesn't fit neatly into cartoons. The military has its own way of absorbing legends. They become vignettes in doctrine,
case studies in leadership, parables with footnotes. Tie yourself to the mission, read the last bullet of the Reynolds module, a phrase that cadets repeated to each other on cold ranges and in windowless classrooms when plans fell apart in exercises. The phrase migrated, as useful things do, beyond its origin. A medic said it before a mass casualty drill. An aviation crew chief muttered it when a checklist grew long and a storm line brushed the horizon. A logistics officer scribbled it on a whiteboard next to a list of priorities no one wanted to triage. The staff jokes were gentle: find the tree, face the road. The seriousness underneath was real. Years after the funeral, a letter arrived, addressed to Annie at the old farmhouse, the stamp foreign, the envelope battered from handling. She sat at the kitchen table where her father used to mend clocks and opened it with the same pocket knife he'd used on 100 envelopes. The paper smelled of dust and heat. The signature block identified a sergeant, infantry, deployed. He wrote in a clear, blocky hand, "Ma'am, you don't know me. My platoon is on our 3rd month here. The terrain is different, but some things rhyme. We've got a crossroads that matters and a radio that lies twice a day. Morale took a hit last week. I was looking for something to steady the line. Our Battalion S3 emailed a packet of historical case studies. I read about your father in a plywood office with a generator coughing outside. I wrote 3 phrases on duct tape and stuck them above the door. Face the road, choose simple, keep your boys together. The men started repeating them without me telling them to. We got through the week. That's the whole story. Please know his echo carries. Respectfully." Annie folded the letter and leaned back, the chair's old slats creaking their familiar song. Outside, wind ran through the corn, wrote its own cursive across the field.
She thought of the porch evenings, the cane, the way he looked at the horizon, as if it were a person he was courteous to. She placed the letter under the magnet next to the faded photo of her mother's red scarf and the snapshot of a melted barrel catching late light. A shrine of paper and iron to a man who always insisted shrines were for other people. A documentary crew came once, earnest and underfunded, audio levels fighting a refrigerator that refused to cooperate. They set a microphone on the kitchen table and asked to see anything that remained from the war. Annie brought the box. Tags, the pocket New Testament, the bent buckle, the V-mail copies he'd saved of the letters he sent to a 7-year-old who needed to know spring would return. The director asked, cautious, whether the nickname had bothered him. He said it wasn't true, Annie replied, but he also said it wasn't an insult if someone meant gratitude. He let people call him what they needed to call him. Then he went back to work. The crew nodded, as if that answer slid a weight into the right tray on an invisible scale. In classrooms, a different kind of immortality took root. A high school teacher in Iowa assigned his students to write a letter to anyone in history whose actions survived them. One letter began, "Dear Sergeant Reynolds, I don't know how to fire a machine gun, and I've never been cold for more than a soccer game, but I tried out for first chair clarinet because you tied yourself to a tree, and I figured I could at least tie myself to a practice schedule." Another, "Dear Sir, I thought immortality was about fame. Then my mom showed me the sign at Reynolds Crossing. I think maybe it's about usefulness. Thanks for being useful." The teacher mailed the stack to Annie, who kept them in the shoebox where the camera tape once lived, a cardboard ark ferrying small artifacts across years that swelled and receded. The Army War College updated its packet again. The new edition included a small sidebar headed Logistics Notes, because someone argued, correctly, that myth without mechanics is just mist. The sidebar listed the weight of a Browning, the belt capacity, the mean time between jams at sub-zero temperatures, the likelihood of hypothermia versus hemorrhage in a still body at -10 degrees F, the tensile strength of WW2 field wire. A colonel wrote the caption, "Heroism is rarely magic. It's often math performed under moral pressure." Students underlined that sentence and carried it into staff meetings where calendars and conscience collided. Back at the county line, the sign took a beating from weather and trucks.
One spring, a snowplow clipped its post and left it leaning at an angle, like a man considering whether to rise. The county replaced it within a week, and the crew chief sent Annie a text with a photo. Straight as a yardstick now. She texted back a thank you and added a coffee emoji, a private joke she'd developed with herself. She liked the thought of road crews and their quiet pride. She imagined they would have liked her father, and he would have respected their competence, the way a neatly plowed shoulder resembles character. Every now and then, a man who had once been a boy in Reynolds' squad returned with a family member. The arithmetic of time made those visits rarer.
They parked on the gravel pull-off and stood in silence that wasn't awkward. One of them, his coat too thin for the wind, knelt and pressed his palm to the frozen ground, the way some people touch a headstone. "It's still here," he said to no one in particular. "We're still here." His daughter slipped her arm through his and helped him up, and they walked back to the car in steps that matched without trying. The world layered new wars and new headlines over the old ones. Uniforms changed patterns. Radios learned to whisper through satellites. But the human scale of things remained stubbornly constant. A small team at the edge of something. A leader deciding which way to face. A wire around the waist, not literal now, but felt, so that when consciousness thinned, purpose would hold. Lieutenants who studied algorithms found they reached for a simpler vocabulary when things bit down. Hold the line, tie in, stay with your boys. Memory is a toolkit that shrugs at fashion. On a December night when frost drew delicate maps on the farmhouse windows, Annie brewed coffee and stood at the sink long enough for the timer on the old oven to tick 3 minutes into the dark. She carried a mug to the porch and listened to the cold write its steady music. Across the yard, the workshop door stood shut, but she could see the outline of the melted barrel through the window when a car passed on the road and threw a ribbon of light onto the wall. For a moment, the metal glowed again. She lifted the mug in a small, unconscious salute to a shadow that wasn't there and was everywhere. If you asked her, she would say the legend wasn't the point. The point was the habit of facing what mattered, the habit of being consistent when everything in you wanted to scatter, the habit of knowing your job before the storm. A life reduces to habits at the end, the way a song becomes a rhythm when the melody fades. At the academy, a captain finished the Reynolds lecture by clicking off the projector and making his class stand. "Coats on," he said. "We're walking." They went outside, the wind subtracting heat, breath making brief ghosts. He led them to a rise behind the motor pool and made them choose a line of sight, assign sectors, articulate priorities when they had too few hands for too many tasks. He waited until the answers got plain. Then he told them the last bit. "Courage is attention," he said. "Attention to your duty, to your people, to the ground under your boots. The rest is noise." Uncertain winter mornings, long before the bus roared by and left diesel in its wake, the crossroads looked almost exactly as it had that night. Trees like dark ribs against the pale sky, the road a stitch through a white coat. If you stood there and let the cold climb your bones, you could imagine a man tying wire around his waist with fingers that wouldn't cooperate, then lining his weapon on a world he refused to let pass without accounting for itself. You could imagine him choosing the simple compass, face the road, and letting the mathematics of endurance carry him the rest of the way. No statue marks the spot. There's just the sign and the angle of the hill, and a story that knows how to travel without an escort. But stories like that have their own gravity. They bend things. A private keeps an extra magazine on a long watch. A medic stays 1 minute more beside a quiet patient. A young lieutenant, reading a map in the red light of a cramped vehicle, slides his finger to a junction and thinks not of glory, but of responsibility. In the privacy where decisions are made, an old phrase surfaces like a lifeline. Tie yourself to the mission. Face the road. Keep your boys together. They called him the immortal sergeant because he didn't die the night the arithmetic said he should. But the part that mattered wasn't his heartbeat winning a wager against statistics. It was his refusal to let consciousness or pain or fear turn him away from the thing he had chosen to guard. That refusal outlived him by finding other hands to steady. That is a kind of immortality that counts. And on mornings when the air is sharp enough to ring and the snow remembers how to cover tracks, the crossroads holds its quiet. Trucks pass, farmers wave. Somewhere a school bell sounds. The wind combs the trees. If you stop your car and step out and listen hard, you will hear nothing miraculous. Just the clean, persistent metronome of a place that once taught a man which way to face, and the echo of his choice moving forward along the road.